Thank you everybody for joining us this evening for this presentation of the History of Juneteenth with Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson. Dr. Carter Jackson is an associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Her research focuses on slavery and the abolitionists, violence as a political discourse, historical film, and Black women's history. She is the author of Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, and the co-editor of Reconsidering Roots, Race, Politics, and Memory, which has a foreword written by Henry Louis Gates Jr. She is also executive producer and host of the podcast Oprah-demics, the study of the Queen of Talk, which I definitely encourage everyone to check out. And her essays have been featured just about everywhere you could think of. She is the commissioner for the Massachusetts Historical Commission and the historian in residence for the Museum of African American History in Boston. And somehow, even with all of that going on, she has time this evening to speak with us about the history of Juneteenth. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Carter Jackson. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I should also add mom of three. So I stay pretty busy. My kids are 8, 5, and 2. So they keep me on my toes all the time. So, but with that, I'm really, really excited to share this Juneteenth talk. I was just talking to Allison earlier about how, this is like retail at Christmas for historians. We get like February and now we get June as another opportunity to really introduce Black history in ways that people have not always been exposed to and have not always been taught in their K through 12 education. And so being able to talk about what Juneteenth is about, why it matters, how we should celebrate, what's an appropriate way to celebrate, I think is going to be really useful. So we're going to have fun today. I'm going to talk a lot about joy. I'm going to talk also a lot about delays, because that's what Juneteenth really is. It was delay. But we're also going to talk about delight too, and how Black people experience their liberation for the first time. So I'm going to share my slides and just dive in, and then I will leave time at the end for questions. So please, if you have a question that you want to ask me, write it down and we will jump into it with the last several minutes that we have left. So what I want to do today is really just give you an overview. I don't want to assume where anybody's knowledge base is. I want to just be able to give context for those who are not familiar. So when I start talking about the history of Juneteenth, I actually start with the Emancipation Proclamation. And I start with the Emancipation Proclamation. Hold on 1 second. Nope, that's there we go. I start with the Emancipation Proclamation because I see it as such an important precursor. The Emancipation Proclamation freed 3 million of the 4 million people enslaved. All of the enslaved people that were in the rebellion states. Later, the states that are the border states like Maryland or Missouri or Kentucky, they eventually wind up freeing their slaves as well. But 3 million, I mean, you're talking about the greatest emancipation in the history of the Atlantic world. So when that comes in 1863, people are jubilant. They are explosive in their joy. They're looking for their family members, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers. They're trying to find ways to celebrate, trying to find places where they can relocate to get away from the plantation. It is such a special moment, but a lot is happening. There's a lot of movement that's taking place during the Civil War and at the end of the Civil War as well. And what happens at the end of the Civil War, which ends in April of 1865, the war is completely over. And it is not until about 2-3 months later where Union troops make their way to Texas and basically proclaim freedom for those who were still enslaved. Now, a lot of people have argued that Texas slaveholders knew that slavery had been abolished, but they wanted to get 1 or 2 more harvest seasons out of their human property before the Union troops arrived. And also a lot of enslaved people, it's been argued that they knew that they were free as well, but they were basically being held hostage until Union troops arrived. So when that happens, when General Gordon Granger arrives in Galveston, Texas, to proclaim that the war is over and all enslaved people are free, henceforth and forever free, It is joy and jubilance like you have never, ever seen. And people celebrated on that day. They celebrated in 1866, and they continued to celebrate every single year, primarily in Texas, but all throughout the country, people were having Juneteenth celebrations. It's in Texas where Juneteenth becomes an official holiday in 1980, and then, of course, an official federal holiday just last year. But the fact that people were celebrating and have been celebrating for over 150 years is quite remarkable. So I want to give you this quote. This is by a formerly enslaved person, Felix Hayward, who talks about what it means to experience Juneteenth. So this is part of the New Deal project in the 1930s, when a lot of enslaved people were quite elderly. Part of the New Deal administration, Roosevelt said, let's go out and let's interview all of these people. Let's get their oral histories. And a lot of these people were still well in their right mind, even in their 80s and their 90s, and they talked about the experience of what freedom meant to them. And this is one person, Hayward, who says, the end of the war, it come just like that, like you snap your fingers. Hallelujah broke out. Soldiers all of a sudden was everywhere, coming in bunches, crossing, walking, and riding. Everyone was a singing. We was all walking on golden clouds. Everyone went wild. We was free. Just like that, we was free. And when I think about this moment, this jubilation that comes from emancipation, we cannot overestimate how big that feeling must have been, especially for people that had been enslaved for generations. For over 250 years, there was slavery in this country. So this is a picture of enslaved people or formerly enslaved people who are celebrating in the streets. This is a celebration that came with the Emancipation Proclamation, in which they are hosting up pictures of the Emancipation Proclamation. They're letting everyone know, hey, freedom is here. We no longer have to be at the plantation. We no longer have to be exploited and susceptible to violence. And we own our own personhood now. And that was such a huge moment. I think about this picture, which is kind of grainy. It's not the best photograph, but it's so powerful in that this is where you see about 31 people at a Juneteenth celebration in Emancipation Park in Houston. And this is in 1880. So just one generation outside of slavery. And you can see that everyone is in their Sunday best. They're in their best clothes, white dresses, top hats. This was a celebration. It was a moment where people came together and ate and had parades and gave speeches and talked about what it meant to be free. And so in 1880, you would definitely have formerly enslaved people who would perhaps come up to a stage, come before the group, and give their personal testimony, talk about what they had faced, the trauma, the harm, the violence, and then how they overcame and what it was like to live their life in freedom and to see their children or grandchildren experience freedom. This is Emancipation Park. This is what it looks like today in Houston. I'm from Texas. I was not born there, but I did my last 2 years of high school in Texas. And now all of my family pretty much lives in Houston or the Dallas area. And I've been to Emancipation Park before. This was 10 acres purchased by a group of formerly enslaved people. This is when they purchased it in the 1870s for $800, which is a lot of money. But they pulled all of their money together from either selling food or selling clothes. Enslaved people were very, very talented because they built America. So they oftentimes sold out their labor or sold out their skills and talents, and then used that money that they raised in their churches and did fundraising in order to purchase this land and make it a place that they could come back to again and again to say, this place, this land is ours, and we mark this as Emancipation Park. And to this day, this is where all of the major Juneteenth celebrations are in Houston. And there's parades and food and, bazaars. It's pretty great. So when we think about this moment, I think it's always important to put it within a historical context. So when we're talking about the end of the Civil War, we're talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. These were 3 new amendments that get added to the Constitution. And we remember that, Lincoln was hesitant to add amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution had not been amended for decades. So adding 3 new amendments was a really big deal. The first of those amendments is the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, except as a form of incarceration. Now that's a whole nother lecture, right? It's a whole nother lecture about mass incarceration and how the 13th has really created the space for Black exploitation in perpetuity. But the 13th Amendment effectively abolished the institution of slavery. The 14th Amendment, of course, grants citizenship to all people. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed that no American would be denied the right to vote based on race, not sex, but race. These amendments were so instrumental for Black people in terms of how they found meaning in their citizenship, meaning in their liberation. My advisor, Eric Foner, he wrote this book called Nothing But Freedom, because one of the arguments that was made was that slaves got nothing but freedom. But that's not completely true. There were constitutional amendments that were made. There were huge opportunities that enslaved people had that nowhere in the Atlantic world you get to see. So when I talk about this moment after the Civil War, I talk about the period of Reconstruction. And I think this period is the probably least taught and least understood period in American history. If you were in a K through 12 education, you might get, slavery, you would get the Civil War, and then the next thing you know, it's like the Gilded Age, the Great Depression, World War II, we leap through history so quickly. But Reconstruction is so important because even though it was short-lived, even though it does not last very long, the changes that were brought about in a short amount of time were unprecedented. So during Reconstruction, you get the first established universal primary education that's free primary public school for everyone, not just Black children, but everyone. So poor white children for the first time are getting access to go to school. It's not just the elite that are sending their children off to these schools or boarding schools or private schools. Now everyone has a chance at education. And this is also important because you have effectively missionaries, teachers that are leaving the North and going to the South to educate this newly freed population. Charlotte Gordon Granger is one of them. She is, a famous Black woman abolitionist. I named my daughter Charlotte after her. All my children are named for abolitionists. And it's so special to me to think that people saw that they had a real duty to make sure that enslaved people were brought into the fold of American citizenship, and that included their education. The second that Reconstruction did that was huge was it established the first public health departments. Now that we are coming to the tail end, or I don't know where we are in this pandemic, but now we understand, I think, so intensely what it means to have a public health department, what it means to promote public health and sanitation. And that is because all during the Civil War, there were epidemics of Spanish flu and influenza and tuberculosis. And the casualty numbers are so high in the Civil War, not just because of bullets, but because people were dying from disease. If you got sick, if you got an infection, it was very difficult to recover from that. And so prioritizing public health for newly freed people and all Americans was a part of this agenda. And then lastly, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I'm giving the highlights, the Civil Rights Act of 1865. This is the last major piece of Reconstruction legislation, and it outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodation. So hotels, transportation, opera houses. It's a real tribute to Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner, the famous abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, who was beaten within an inch of his life within the Senate chamber because he spoke out against slavery. He has just recently died around this moment. And so they used this legislation to really honor his memory. But one of the things that this legislation also speaks to is the fact that you had Black elected officials for the first time occupying offices. So nowhere in the Atlantic world, not in Brazil, not in Jamaica, not in, Barbados or Cuba, do you have enslaved people who within one generation or that same generation are now elected officials. went from slavery to the senatorship. like how we don't see that anywhere. That's how incredible Reconstruction was. So I'm going to show you some pictures. This is of a schoolhouse in the South in which Black people were getting educated in such large numbers. It wasn't just a K through 12, literally infants all the way up to the elderly were being educated and taught literacy for the first time. This is a picture of the first Black elected officials. You had Black senators from places like South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana. You had Black congressmen. You know, Robert Smalls is probably one of my favorites. He's an enslaved man in South Carolina. He steals a ship, a Confederate ship, sails it to Union territory, which is a feat in and of itself, then comes back to South Carolina and says, hey, I'm gonna vote for the first time. And after he votes, he's like, I'm gonna do more than vote. I'm gonna run for office. And he becomes an elected official in South Carolina. And so part of the reason you have the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is so that when these Black elected officials came to Washington, D.C., they had a place to sleep. They had a place to stay. They could ride the train and not be segregated. This is another picture of some of the first Black banks. And what I love about this powerful picture is that there are women here featured prominently in this picture. They make up almost half, if not more, of the people in this picture. My friend, Jeanette Garrett, wrote this wonderful book about Black women in banking. And one of the first things Black people did in a post-slavery world was to create wealth for themselves, or an attempt to create wealth for themselves, to save their money as much as they could, and to invest in their communities. So churches and businesses and small organizations were all putting their money in banks and investing in themselves and investing in their communities, and showing how important it was to have a savings account, to have something that they could save and give to their children, wealth that they could build for their community. But none of this lasts long. None of this has the longevity that it needed to really repair the harm that was caused by chattel slavery. And this is a great quote by Thomas E. Miller of South Carolina. He says, "We were 8 years in power. We built schoolhouses, established charitable institutions, built and maintained the penitentiary systems, provided for the education of the deaf and dumb, rebuilt ferries. In short, we had reconstructed the states and placed it upon the road to prosperity." He's not wrong. He's not wrong. I mean, I did not give you an exhaustive list, but Black people not just built this country with their physical bodies, with their labor during slavery, but even in a post-slavery moment, they are pushing America to actually be the democracy that it claims itself to be. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who writes this great book, this one of the best books I think has ever been written in American history, called Black Reconstruction. And he has this great quote where he says, "If there's one thing that South Carolina feared more than bad Negro government, it was good Negro government." Good Negro government. What does he mean by that? He means that if Black people got into political office, if they got freedom and they squandered it, and they were corrupt, or they were lazy, or they completely, just became like deviants to society, then they would prove that, slavery was a good thing. See, slavery was a civilizing institution. And that's not what happened. Black people got freedom and they perfected themselves. In some ways, they surpassed their white counterparts when it came to education and learning and understanding. And it was that pursuit of perfection and prosperity and citizenship that undermined the myth of white supremacy. So if white people could see Black people accomplishing all these things within a decade, within like 10 to 15 years, then maybe white people weren't supreme. Maybe white people weren't special. And maybe what they did was violently, horrifically wrong. And so when we see things like Reconstruction coming to an end, what we see is a political backlash, an economic backlash, and even a social backlash to how people came to not only promote white supremacy, but also promote anti-Blackness and ideas of anti-Blackness. So this is the book that I talked about by W.E.B. Du Bois called Black Reconstruction. And in it, he says, "The slave went free and stood for a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. And what he's talking about is not just the end of Reconstruction, but he's talking about the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. He's talking about what Rayford Logan calls the nadir, which is the worst period of race relations in American history post-slavery, in which 2 Black people a week are being lynched by mobs. All across the country, you have mob attacks and massacres and lynchings. This is where we talk about Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Black Wall Street that gets bombed and destroyed in Oklahoma. You had towns that got destroyed in Elaine, Arkansas, and in Rosewood, Florida. All across the country, you are seeing these eruptions of white supremacist backlash. And so today I want to talk about a lot of things. I want to spend time talking about Juneteenth, but I want us to also be reminded or be mindful of the fact that white supremacist violence is a through line, that it is a consistent theme throughout American history, that when we go from slavery to the end of the 19th century to the early 20th century, in which the NAACP is literally hanging out a flag every time a man or a woman, for that matter, was lynched. When you think about this second picture here in the middle, this is the bombing of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. When you think about the picture, right center or maybe left center for you, this is Little Rock 9. This is school integration and the fights over school integration that took place to just have 9, not hundreds, but just 9 children integrate Central High School. People lost their minds. And we may look at this as like, oh, well, that's a distant past. No, because we're listening to January 6th hearings right now, thinking about how we have this constant, consistent, white supremacist violence that seeks to like steal, kill, and destroy from Black communities and rob Black people of their citizenship and their humanity. And we have to be mindful that we are constantly at odds with that, and we still have not reckoned with that. So I want to talk about joy, though, because I think that even though Juneteenth is about a delay, a 2-year delay, we also have to think about the fact that enslaved people were happy. And I don't want to take that from them. Were their conditions perfect? No. But they took a moment to celebrate the fact that they were free. And they took that moment every single year whenever they possibly could. And that is because of what Imani Perry says. She's a professor at Princeton, in this beautiful, powerful quote, where she says, racism is terrible, but Blackness is not. Racism is terrible. Blackness is not. Just as American racism, and this is a lengthy quote, but I think it's so worth reading. American racism is unquestionably rapacious. To identify the achievement and acceleration of Black life is not to mute or minimize racism, but to shame racism, to damn it to hell. The masters were wrong in the antebellum South when they described the body-shaking, delighted chuckle of an enslaved person as simple-mindedness. No, that laugh, like our music, like our language, like our movement, was a testimony that refused the terms of our degradation. And then she's talking about the protests of 2020. She says, in the footage of the protests over the past several weeks, we've seen Black people dancing, chanting, singing. Do not misunderstand. This is not an absence of grief or rage or distraction. It is insistence. It is insistence. You know, and when I read this, it just struck me because I'm writing another book now about violence and different kinds of violence. But one of the aspects I talk about in the book is this idea of joyful violence. And my friend was like, joyful violence? What is joyful violence? And I said, it is when you use joy as a weapon. It is when you refuse the terms of your degradation. It is insistence. How can we use joy as a weapon to fight against white supremacy, to fight against anti-Blackness and racism? So I want to show you some really powerful images and ways in which I think Black people are using joy as a weapon. And so when I show you this picture right here, I cannot remember the date. I believe this is probably 1889, but certainly at the end of the 19th century, where once again, you see Black people coming together in their Sunday best, impeccably dressed, to celebrate Emancipation Day, to celebrate what it means to be free. And this picture right here, this is Richmond, Virginia. And I believe this picture, I can't see the date, but it's probably in the early 19 teens or 20s. And this is Richmond, Virginia. Black people are celebrating Emancipation Day by the hundreds. Dare I say by the thousands? They are marching, they are parading. If there is ever a moment of patriotism, Juneteenth is it. Juneteenth is often referred to as the Black 4th of July. The Black 4th of July. And I love that. I love that Black people said, whether or not white people celebrate, we will mark this occasion. We will mark our Freedom Day. I love this picture too, because it's of children, little like children. This is in Dallas, Texas in 1952. And look at them in their little outfits, right? And their little military suits. I mean, this is shortly after World War II has ended. But if there was ever to be patriotism in any group, it is Black Americans. Because not only are Black Americans lovers of this country, but they are such great lovers and that they're constantly calling America, be better, do better, live up to the principles that you proclaim is America, make this place what it is supposed to be. No other group is so much responsible for holding I would say the white and the powerful's feet to the fire than Black Americans. And so even though we have a complicated relationship with our patriotism, the patriotism is always, always there. I love this picture too, because this is the drill team in performing in Minneapolis. This is 1995. And if you've ever been to one of these Juneteenth parades before, particularly in the South, they are so electric and so much fun. You know, maybe not in Minneapolis, but certainly in Texas, where I'm from. You know, you would see the Black cowboys riding on horses, you know, marching through the streets. You would have all of the HBCUs that would show up with their drill teams, and the drums would be going, and just the pure infectious energy that just made you want to like sway or bop or whatever it was. It was in the air, and you could not suppress that joy when you were there at a Juneteenth celebration. And then I love the fact that there are pageants, right? This is Denver, Colorado. A little bit more recently, 2015, this is Miss Juneteenth. And what I love about her is that she's so beautiful with her chocolate skin and her Afro natural hair. And even though she is a beauty queen, she is not sort of like fitting this very stereotypical mold of like, you know, a white, like, you know, blonde, supermodel type Miss America. This is Miss Juneteenth. This is all she represents, a beautiful Black girl in her crown and glory, you know, waving to the people. Like that promotion, not just of Black excellence, but the promotion of Black beauty on Juneteenth is also something to be celebrated. And then I think there's another image, this is much more recent, of a crowd in Austin, Texas, marching the parades. They go for a pretty long time. They're pretty cool if you get to experience one. And then the food for me is like everything. So for me, you know, the color red, not just for me, but traditionally the color red has been something that has become a sacred color on Juneteenth. It is meant to symbolize the perseverance and the bloodshed. And so as much as you can, as possible, the idea is to cook red foods, to prepare red food. So there's red beans and rice, and there's red velvet cake and watermelon and red popsicles. And the recipe in the center looks like red cornbread. I made that last year. It was a hit. It includes bourbon. Who doesn't want bourbon in their cornbread? And it's actually made with beets. You sort of puree the beets, and then you put it into your cornbread mix, and it makes the cornbread red. My kids love it because they're getting vegetables and they don't know it, but like it was delicious. And then you drizzle maple syrup on top and just a sprinkle of salt to have like sweet, salty taste. It was so good. But you know, even if you can just do red soda or strawberries or, you know, red hot links, but red food is always a staple and a centerpiece on Juneteenth. And then if you don't know much about Black culinary traditions, I highly recommend Netflix's High on the Hog. It is probably one of the best 4-part documentaries I have seen in a long time. And it really traces Black culinary traditions from enslavement from the west coast of Africa all the way up into present day. In the last episode, they really dedicate a lot of time talking about Juneteenth and foods that are cooked and prepared on Juneteenth and how meaningful they are. I always like to recommend documentaries, things that people can either watch or read or listen to. I think that's really important. And then the flag. So a lot of people don't know that there's a Juneteenth flag. And I think this is interesting because, you know, oftentimes we see like, you know, yellow and red and green or different kinds of like motifs, but there is an official Juneteenth flag that was actually created by a Boston-based illustrator, and I think that's fantastic. In 1997 by Ben Haith and Lisa Janine Graff. And I want to sort of break down the star. There's something interesting that I found out that most people don't know, is that one of the flags that Texas used to have, which was their own sort of Confederate flag, was just a blue square, and in the center of the square was a white star, and it was called like the Bonnie Blue flag. And you know, it's since been banned, it's become so contested, it's right up there with the Confederate flag. But that blue flag was meant to represent the Confederacy within the state of Texas, and it's called the Bonnie Blue. And so the illustrators, aware of this, wanted to take the Bonnie Blue flag and add their own additions to it that would symbolize Juneteenth and Black freedom and the promise of a new beginning. And so what they did was they kept the star, the Texas Lone Star State, in the center, but then they put a bigger star outside of that, what's called a new star, a supernova. And that new star was meant to represent the beginning. It's also meant to represent like all 50 states, the collection of not just one, but all. And then you see the curve that extends across the width of the flag. That's meant to represent a new horizon. So if you were to look at this flag, it almost looks like a giant sun sort of rising. But I think of this too as well. I think of, you know, the quote by MLK where he says, the arc of justice is long, but it bends, or the arc of, oh gosh, now I'm botching the quote. The arc of something is long, but it bends towards justice. I'll remember the quote in the Q&A, but it bends towards justice. That famous MLK quote is what I was thinking of when I see this flag. But I also think it's interesting is that, you know, the colors of the flag are red, white, and blue. And that is to remind people that, yes, Black people are Americans. They are Americans. And so while we can get caught up in looking at different colors or looking at kente cloth or African prints, but at the end of the day, Black people are Americans in this country. And having the red, white, and blue was an important way of reminding people that. So I think that Juneteenth has become, you know, really a call to push, to move beyond symbolism, really a call to action. I think about how oftentimes when I had attended Juneteenth celebrations in the past, you know, it was a way to register people to vote, to say like, hey, there's so many of us, we're gathering today. And when we have big numbers like this, we want to make sure that people are registered to vote. We want to make sure that people feel empowered when they go to elect their officials and to ask any questions that they might have. We want to make sure during a pandemic that people are safe. So oftentimes Juneteenth, even during the pandemic, was used as a place to say, hey, let's vaccinate as many people as possible. And if you're vaccinated, have you been boosted? Do you need a booster? A call to action. And then, of course, every year, it seems, we are invested in having this conversation about reparations. And really, I think moving the conversation past a conversation into policy, into real change. And I think I've been encouraged to see this perhaps on a small scale, but there are certainly smaller cities that are doing this. So Evanston, a small suburb of Chicago, has basically put in place like a housing program, a housing grant to either purchase a home or to renovate your home for African Americans who've been displaced because of segregation and redlining in that city. There are other places in Vermont that have tried to create their own sort of small scale reparations across the country. So it is absolutely possible. And we have a precedent for reparations. We absolutely have a precedent. You know, if you think of Japanese internment camp, there was reparations for them. If you think about slaveholders, there was reparations for them. Slaveholders in Washington, D.C. were compensated for the loss of their property. And even in Great Britain, and especially in France, for those who read that scathing New York Times piece about Haiti, Black, or I should say white slaveholders in Europe were compensated for their property. So it's not as though we don't have a historical precedent for what reparations can do. But I think it's even important to have these conversations in the classroom. You know, when we saw the summer of 2020 and 2021, and even a little bit now, these, you know, ideas about critical race theory and banning these conversations in the classroom are so dangerous, so dangerous, because history is our roadmap. History is our guidebook for seeing what has happened before and understanding what might be possible in the future. So I want to give you this quote by my good friend Charles McKinney, who, when I read this quote, I was like, that's it, that's everything. I think that oftentimes, you know, we think about Black people, and we think that they're a reactionary people, that they're constantly having to react to white supremacy, react to whiteness. But Charles McKinney says, no, we are not solely the history of fighting white folks. That is not who we are. We are double Dutch in the summer. We are letting out the air of Big Mama's house. We are Uncle Ray's jokes on top of jokes. We are collards and second lines and blue lights in the basement. We are swagger in the midst of chaos. We are reunions and step shows and the borough and the bayou. We are church till 2 and the corner till 4. We are a universe of experiences. And when I read that quote, I was just like, wow, wow. We cannot lose sight of the fact that Black people are more than just the people constantly fighting white people. And then in America, we have contributed so much to this country, but equally important, we have contributed so much to each other. We have poured in so much to each other. And that is why it's so important to fight for joy during this day, during this holiday. You know, Zora Hurston has this great quote where she says, I am not tragically colored. There is no great sorrow dammed up in my soul, nor lurking behind my eyes. I do not mind at all. I do not belong to the sobbing school of Negrohood who hold that the nature somehow has given them a low down dirty deal and whose feelings are all but about it. No, I do not weep at the world. I'm too busy sharpening my oyster knife. And in some ways, you know, I love that this is how it feels to be colored me. I love being reminded that I am so much more than my oppression, so much more than my marginalization, so much more than what I'm constantly combating against. And so I try to remind, you know, myself a lot that Black joy matters. So I saw this quote on Twitter, and it says, some of us fight racism by raising our children to know joy. This matters too. And when I think about this, I think about my kids. I had my 3 children, and they were playing in the crib, and William, my son, wanted to be silly. He was like, hey, Mom, look. And he like spread the t-shirt open, and we hollered laughing. Like, we laughed so hard. I don't even know how I got all of that on camera, because to see my daughter, you know, with her head cocked back in laughter, my son laughing, you know, my daughter, my baby's like, what is going on? Like, it was just pure joy at bedtime. That's all it was. It's joy at bedtime. And I loved that in that moment, I didn't have to say, you know, you're Black, you're beautiful, you're this. We could just have a special time, and we could laugh, and we could be together, and I could empower them to know that their joy is meaningful, that their joy, that their laughter matters, and that even their laughter can be a weapon in hard times, can be a weapon when someone is trying to demoralize and degrade you. So I often think, as I start to wrap up, I want us to think about the fact that in February, we celebrate Black History Month. In February, we go back into the past and we think about all the things that Black people have contributed to this country. But in June, I want us to think about Black Futures Month. I want us to think about where we might go. What is the kind of world that we want to live in? What is the kind of world that we want to create or imagine for ourselves, for our children, for our children's children? This matters too, not just the past, not just the present, but the future. And so I want to play this clip that I saw on Google. Maybe you have seen it before. It is one of my favorite commercials. It's only 1 minute long, but again, probably one of the quickest and yet most powerful encapsulation of Black excellence.
Right. All right. Can I get an amen? And welcome to the very first National Algorithm Show!
I love it. I love it. I get chills. I tell you, I've seen this 1,000 times and I get chills every time I watch this clip. It is so, so powerful. So powerful. Oh, wait, we're not going to watch it again. Hold on. Let me skip to the next slide. I want to end with just two quotes, and I will wrap up. The first is The Weathered Hands of Henry Burke, who's a formerly enslaved man in Georgia, in Greene County, Georgia. This is him in 1941. And I look at these hands, and in his hands, I see the past, I see our present, and I also see our future. I see the great harm that's been caused, the delay that's been caused, but I also see the hope and the promise and the resilience and the delight that comes with freedom when all people are free, truly free. I think of this quote by W.E.B. Du Bois, who at the end of his life wrote this. He said, "For this is a beautiful world. This is a wonderful America, which the founding fathers dreamed until their sons drowned it in the blood of slavery and devoured it in greed." But Du Bois was hopeful. He then added, "Our children must rebuild it." He requested that the dead must rebuke the blind who think what is will be forever. He concluded, "Teach us forever dead. There is no dream but deed. There is no deed but memory." And what he is saying is that it's not about the dream. It's not about MLK. It's not about what we hope to be or think to be, but it is about what we do. It's about the deed. It's about what we do. And equally important to what we do is how we remember what we did, the memory. The memory. As a historian, I'm always saying there's the history and there's the memory. Both are powerful. Both have huge impacts in understanding what we believe is possible. So this Juneteenth, I want us to think about a lot of things. I want us to think about dreams. I want us to think about deeds. I want us to think about delays. And I want us to think about delight. So thank you so much for letting me share this lecture with you.